The letter that changed everything. The studio was ice cold under the burning lights. Face the Divide, live from Washington, D.C., wasn't just another political show. It was a collision course. 60 audience members formed a perfect arc around the stage, seated like silent jurors while cameras hovered overhead, ready to catch blood. On the screen behind them, the title burned like a challenge. Grit versus Gifted. What truly defines success in America? Karoline Leavitt entered first, polished, confident, dressed for combat. Her presence screamed order, superiority, control. Every gesture calculated. She believed success came from structure, not struggle. To her, resilience was just a fancy word for excuse. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. No smile, no flash, just quiet defiance wrapped in a dark dress. Every step she took was a reminder. She didn't arrive through legacy. She clawed her way here. The applause for her was lighter but deeper, coming from those who recognize what it takes to survive with nothing. The host leaned in. Tonight we ask, does greatness come from privilege or pain? The cameras tightened on Jasmine's face. No blink, no flinch. Somewhere in the control room, someone whispered, something's about to happen. This wasn't debate anymore. This was reckoning. Karoline leaned forward, smiling like a blade, and delivered a line sharp enough to split the air. I don't believe in overcoming hardship, she said deliberately, each word a scalpel. That phrase to me is nothing more than the language of people who want to justify failure. America doesn't need people who've fallen and gotten back up. America needs people strong enough not to fall in the first place. The words didn't land. They exploded. Applause erupted from the front left section. Suits, tight ties, folded hands now unfolding in satisfaction. But not everyone followed. In the middle rows, audience members exchanged glances. Others sat frozen, arms crossed tighter. And on stage, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't flinch or reach for the mic. She simply looked at Karoline and held her gaze, not with defiance, but with something more unsettling. The calm of someone who had already lived through what the other woman was only theorizing. Meanwhile, camera 3 moved quietly, almost instinctively. Not to Jasmine, not to Karoline, but to the back row. There, in the outermost curve, sat a young black woman, no older than 19. Her white blouse gleamed softly under the studio lights, but her expression was locked in quiet intensity. In her lap was a folded piece of paper. 3 creases, corners slightly torn. Not decorative, not crisp, a letter aged from being carried too long. When Jasmine finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned in. I was 14 when my mother came home with a plastic bag and a pink slip, she began, her voice low but unmistakably clear. The bag had 2 loaves of bread, a carton of eggs, and a note saying she was no longer needed. That was the day I stopped being a kid. The room went still, dead still. We had $27 left and rent due in 4 days. That night, while some kids were worrying about homework, I was in a stranger's office scrubbing coffee stains off a mahogany desk I'd never be allowed to sit behind. She continued, her voice gaining strength. Lunch became 2 slices of bread with ice cubes in between. My little brother studied on the floor under the window, not because it was comfortable, but because the street lamp outside was our only light source after 7 p.m., and when it rained, he had to stop. Jasmine looked around the room slowly, without blinking. I didn't grow up knowing what extra credit was. I knew what late fees were. I learned how to read lease agreements before I learned how to balance equations, because one mistake could mean sleeping in a different zip code the next day. Her hands didn't move, but her voice sharpened. You talk about people who never fall. That's privilege talking. I didn't fall because I was careless. I fell because the ground beneath me was never solid to begin with. A long silence followed, the kind that follows testimony, not commentary. But before Jasmine's words had truly landed, Karoline leaned forward, her smile tight and sharp. Sure, she said coolly. That was moving. But being able to tell a sad story doesn't make someone a leader. It just makes them a survivor. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Let's not confuse surviving with succeeding. You made it through some rough years. Fine, but that doesn't mean you're fit, to sit at the table where real decisions are made. There was not an argument, but a dismissal wrapped in logic, delivered like a verdict. The camera operator instinctively zoomed in on Jasmine, who sat perfectly still, not frozen but composed. This wasn't new. She had heard this before in fancier rooms with bigger ceilings and more polished accents. In the back row, the young student with the folded letter hadn't moved, but something in her face had shifted. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles pale where they gripped that worn paper. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was bracing. Jasmine's response was measured. You think strength means never falling? That's not strength. That's luck or insulation, or both. Because if you've never been knocked down, it's not because you're strong. It's because someone kept the floor clean for you. As her words lingered in the sterile silence, a chair scraped against the floor. All eyes turned to see the young woman from the back row now standing. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look for a microphone. She simply stepped into the aisle with that folded letter pressed flat against her chest. Her voice, when it came, was clear, not loud, not forced, just a kind that only exists when truth has lived inside you too long. I wrote this letter to Representative Jasmine Crockett exactly 1 year ago. It was part of my college scholarship application, but really, it was a letter I never thought anyone would hear. The room held still, as if the floor itself understood the weight of what was being said. I was 17, living in the back seat of a 2003 Ford Taurus with my mom. She worked nights at a storage facility. We parked behind gas stations, covered the windows with jackets, ate dinner from vending machines. Or not at all. I didn't have Wi-Fi. I didn't have a desk. I studied by holding cereal boxes under streetlights. I memorized the multiplication table off the back of an old Raisin Bran box. That was how I prepped for midterms. She swallowed once, but her voice didn't waver. I was told not to talk about any of that in my essay. A guidance counselor said it might make donors uncomfortable. But then one night, I saw a video of Jasmine Crockett testifying in Congress. I didn't even know what the hearing was about. I just remember the way she spoke. She didn't clean it up. She didn't shrink herself. She looked directly at Jasmine now. You look like my mom. You sounded like the women I knew, and you weren't apologizing for it. She unfolded the last part of the letter. In that essay, I quoted something you said, "We don't overcome hardship to be admired. We overcome it, so we never have to wait for someone to hand us value we already had." I copied that down in a notebook with a broken binding. That line made me rewrite my entire essay. I told the truth for the first time. Her voice dropped lower in gravity, and I got the scholarship. Not because I made people comfortable, but because I finally stopped pretending I wasn't worth anything unless I did.
Then she simply said, "Thank you," and returned to her seat, leaving behind not applause, not debate, but something far heavier, proof that Jasmine hadn't just survived. She had lit a path for someone else to follow out of the dark. The video appeared online just past midnight with no fanfare, simply titled, "A Student Read a Letter and the Room Went Silent." No logo, no intro, just raw footage. The views rose like smoke, 1,000, then 10,000, then 100,000. It didn't trend. It didn't need to. The comment section was unlike anything the internet had seen. No arguments, no insults, just confessions. "I watched this 3 times and still can't move." That line about the cereal box. I lived that. I never said it out loud until now. She didn't just read a letter. She gave us permission to tell the truth. Within days, something began to shift. Not on screens, but in people. In a Colorado Springs high school, students entered class to find a single line written across the board, "Write a letter to the person who helped you stand when you didn't think you could." A retired Army sergeant in Indiana watched the video and retrieved a 17-year-old letter from his wallet, written in purple marker by his daughter when she was a child. He drove across town to give it back to her, now 30 with a child of her own. While the media hungered for Jasmine's response, she remained silent, not because she didn't care, but because she understood something rare. When a moment becomes bigger than the person who sparked it, speaking again too soon is not leadership. It's ego. Finally, on the 4th day, she sent a single-line email with no subject. "I don't need to be remembered. I just need someone somewhere, Someday to feel strong enough to ask for help and not feel ashamed for doing it. No follow-up, no clarification, but somehow that one sentence hit harder than 1,000 press releases ever could. A high school counselor in Phoenix printed that line and taped it to her office door. A family therapist in Kentucky placed it in her waiting room. At a university in New Jersey, a professor read it to a lecture hall of exhausted seniors. In these corners, unseen and unmeasured, Jasmine's words were doing something no algorithm could predict. They were giving people permission to be human, to not know, to ask without shame. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt stepped back onto stages across the country, expecting business as usual. But something had changed. At an event in Des Moines, a school principal raised her hand and asked, "I don't want to know where you went to college. I want to know who picked you up when you fell." The questions kept coming, not hostile, but different. They weren't asking for her qualifications. They were asking for her scars. And Karoline had spent a lifetime making sure no one could see those. As the weeks passed, a photo appeared online, a desk in early morning light, a folded letter resting beside a wide-ruled student notebook. Written across the top page in pencil, "Today I wrote a letter to myself. I'm not ashamed anymore." The photo didn't go viral in the traditional sense. It was passed from inbox to inbox, teacher to student, friend to friend. Underneath, someone had commented, "Real education begins the moment someone is brave enough to ask, 'Do you understand?' and stays long enough to hear the answer." In a classroom in Kansas, a teacher replaced her "Work hard, dream big" poster with this photo. In a juvenile detention center in Maryland, teens began a project called Letters We Owe Ourselves. In nursing homes, offices, and living rooms, people started writing, not for likes or shares, but for themselves. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a rupture. Because what happened in that studio didn't just challenge a debate. It challenged a belief system, the lie that some people are born understanding, that leadership only belongs to the polished, that dignity must be earned in perfect grammar and uninterrupted confidence. The human lesson wasn't about Jasmine. It wasn't even about the student. It was about all of us. How many times we've stayed quiet when we didn't know the answer, how many times we've mistaken confusion for failure instead of seeing it as the beginning of learning. The most revolutionary thing we can do is listen long enough for someone to feel safe saying, "No, I don't understand," and stay until they do. That's the fire Jasmine lit. And no amount of silence will ever put it out. Now it's your turn, to write your letter, to ask your question, to make room for someone else's voice. To make the world quieter so the voices that were once invisible can finally be heard. Because at the end of all the shouting, all the debating, the question that echoes most isn't, "Did you win?" It's, "Who did you make feel like they finally belonged in the room?"